in the Facebook group for the YouTube RPG Brigade, where the producers of videos and those who comment on them gather together to, further the conversation. A post was made today about worst session ever. One of the members posted saying that they had just run the worst session of their lives and was wondering whether or not they should do a video. I definitely think that this is a useful topic, not only just to share and unload the negativity that can come with having a bad session, but also to share in the sense of solidarity of people who have also had bad sessions for different reasons. And by getting all those different reasons out there, I think we can have a productive discussion on what actually happens at the table and what we have learned about ourselves as a result of that, or what we're still trying to sort out. Why did things go this way? And so my worst session ever. I'm actually going to break this clip down into 2 sections. My worst session ever, and the type of session or the type of game group which I find leads to unsatisfactory gaming. So the type of game that I know is going to be unsatisfactory and the worst session ever. So let's start off with the worst session ever. The worst session ever for me was back when I was running Werewolf the Apocalypse. The game was pretty new then. I had set up an adjunct to my main Vampire Chronicle. I had decided that as the games were coming out, I was going to just keep adding them in. And there are people who've had good experience with that and people who've had bad experience with that. I found it to be a positive experience, and we made it all the way through to Changeling, the original, first edition, without a lot of difficulty. Some of these games didn't get a lot of play, some of them didn't get a lot of focus, but they were all incorporated into the Chronicle as it went on. And the worst session ever happened. This was my second group to whom I'd introduced Werewolf. And this was a great group. I really enjoyed playing with them in a bunch of other games. I'd played Shadowrun with some of them, and played two campaigns of Shadowrun with them, and some Palladium Fantasy and other stuff. And we had entered into the World of Darkness with this group through Werewolf, and they were going to join into the Vampire campaign a little later, but because Vampire was the hot new thing, and I was hoping to do a lot of crossover stuff, what we did was introduce these new players into my World of Darkness Chronicle via Werewolf and Mortals, but we'll get to that. So the worst session ever involved the group creating this plan of how they were going to assault a stronghold of vampires in their territory. They had been a force of proactivity in their cairn, and were slowly convincing the elders that there were enough young, capable warriors that they could drive the worm back a little further, that they could take this area, which it was basically spiraling down into darkness, and they could turn it around. And there was a lot of high drama, there was a lot of high adventure, and in conversations which I've had with the group after, I learned that there was a very strong sense of bonding of player to character, and it's a very tight-knit game group, and we were coming up to the first really big advancements in rank that some of them were due for. They'd been accruing renown. They'd been making changes. They'd been making names for themselves, and it was time for them to really stand before a large area moot and tell their tales and what they called begging for renown in front of the elders and move up to be some movers and shakers in the guru community. And to carry this out, they had been following these clues, these hints, and they had realized that there was this small, what they call a nest of vampires, of leeches, that had taken up residence in this border town. And they were running drugs and smuggling guns and were basically this conduit for all of the bad things that were going on in the area's cities. I had said it in Atlantic Canada, so I was from Atlantic Canada, and so all these small little cities were connected in these plots, and the underground community, both supernatural and just criminal, were linked through all of these cities. And so they were going to make a strike on this group of leeches that they suspected were basically responsible for bringing in all of this foul stuff. And they were particularly concerned about the guns. And so they laid this plan of assault. And where the session that was bad was the session where they decided to put this plan into action. And it started out being bad. I'll take full responsibility for the session being bad, which is not to say that no one else made mistakes, but I'm going to say that the first mistake was mine. What I did was I brought in some friends that I had game with in college, and I brought them in because I wanted that night's session to be special. And I knew that there were going to be a lot of NPCs. It was going to be a mass combat. The werewolves were bringing in NPC allies that they had made, and there were kinfolk allies that were going to show up. And then, of course, the vampires themselves had ghouls and other allies that were going to come up, and it was going to be a really, really, really big battle. And it had been my habit in ages past to recruit people to come in and play a lot of these NPCs. And so I didn't explain this. To heighten the mystery and just to get things moving, I never did explain why these guys were had joined the group and why they weren't doing anything. And they were sitting there with their character sheets, and they had werewolf character sheets, and they had vampire character sheets, and they had gangster character sheets, and they had all this stuff on their clipboards, and they were waiting for certain signals, and I had no idea how the plan was going to be carried out. So I explained who their different NPCs were and where they were, and depending on where the players actually went would determine whether or not that aid would be activated or not. That was the easiest way to take care of it, and it meant I didn't have to communicate with my extra players, my NPC players, at all. They knew that if that the werewolves broke into the storage shed behind the vampires mansion, that the NPC that they were controlling that was in there was free to act. And so it was a very simple system. But where it broke down was all of the players in the Chronicle assumed that the guys I had recruited for that night were going to be playing their werewolf allies. And they kept getting more and more frustrated when these werewolf allies didn't show up. Now, there was a very good reason why they didn't show up, but it wasn't something I could I could just explain. And so they finally decide to lead the assault and ignored their own plan. I really can't put it any differently than that. They had come up with this really good plan, and then the group started to argue. The members of the group started to argue, both in character and out of character. And I'm thinking that this was probably because of the raised tension of who are these guys who are sitting on the sofa not doing anything, and why aren't their characters showing up, you know? And they split up. The guys who wanted to stick to the plan stuck to the plan and went off and tried to carry it out without enough resources. And the guys who decided to make a new plan on the spot, they eventually succumbed to their rage and were just destroying everything. So by the time this had happened, the vampires had been alerted for quite some time and put themselves into defensive positions and were calling allies like mad and were freaking out thinking, you know, we're actually going to be attacked by actual werewolves. And they worked themselves up into this state. And it's daytime. Are they going to be able to make their humanity rolls and that sort of thing? And unfortunately for the werewolf players, they managed to be awake by the time that the attack hit, and they were pretty devastating. They were armed. This was the thing. They were arms dealers. They were armed with some pretty heavy, you know, for the campaign at that point, pretty heavy firepower. And they made a mess of some of the big heavy hitters in the group, to such a point that possibly their careers as warriors were over. The original werewolf, you know, there was a lot of, say, critical injuries and for massive damage, and a lot of these characters were never going to be the same again, which is always a tricky thing with players. You don't really know how they're going to take to the maiming of their character, if that's going to enhance their experience or detract from it. And in this case, the session had already been so hostile, had gone into violence. The violence had not gone well, and the guys gunning down the PCs were, you know, my friends, you know, from another game or something. And yeah, it was the worst session ever. It got so bad, in fact, that that players are making choices that would lead the rest of their party into more of this onslaught, you know, and so everybody was getting screwed up. And of course, that was the end of the pack. Not everybody died, but a lot of people were horribly maimed, and the pack was broken up, and they went off and formed separate packs, and some characters continued to adventure, and for some, that was the end. So major chronicle shifting event, and it didn't have to go the way that it did. And of course, the reason why it went that way is failure to communicate, and you know, not sticking to the plan on the part of the players, and it was a really shame. It was a real shame. The characters that were lost were great characters. The group dynamic was great, and you know, that session actually ended up with losing players from the group, and some of them I never got back into my group to this day, and you know, not for play by email or anything like that. So, you know, way up there on the scale of worst session ever. Now, to finish this clip off with types of session that I know are not going to be fun. It's when I'm introducing a new game and I'm laying out the explanation of the game. You know, like if I'm the only one with the rules, and I'm laying out this is the setting, this is the genre, this is the expectations, this is the pitch for the initial campaign, that I'd like to suggest, and then we'll all get to know the game, and then if we like it, we'll continue, and if we want to make some changes, we can stop and make changes. That kind of situation. And when I get a group of players who do not listen to any of that, they've got a character idea in their head from some other game, some other time, some other place, and they try and shoehorn that character into the mechanics. And I'm saying things like, well, you can do that, but, and they're not listening to the but part. And at my age and years of experience now, when that happens, I don't run the game. There's just no reason to run the game. It's not going to be fun for them, and it's not going to be fun for me. So that's everybody. It's not going to be fun for anybody, so why run it? Yeah. When that happens, and I can't get through to the group about that game, I'll make suggestions for another game. I will step back and suggest, relevant movies or books to get into. I'll start a conversation about the genre, and if I'm still not getting through, or I'm not getting through to everybody, then I'll cherry pick the people that do get it for that game and try with them, or I just wipe the slate clean and suggest something else. So an example of this would be the first time I tried to do Hollow Earth Expedition in Seoul. I had 2 players to start, with a third going to join, and they had no exposure to the source material. They had no interest in reading through the material in the book, and as soon as the characters were introduced into play, there was nothing really wrong with the characters as they were constructed, but as soon as they introduced the characters into play, it basically turned into the murder hobo kind of thing that people talk about with their D&D campaigns, except this wasn't some fantasy world. This was 1938 Shanghai, with a very hyperactive police force and military presence and gangsters, and going around just knocking off the opposition is going to get somebody upset and cause retaliation. And so that game came to a very, very short end. Fortunately for me, I was able to see enough of the mechanic in action to know that Hollow Earth is a great game. I just needed to find a different set of players. So, worst game session ever, worst type of game session. I look forward to hearing what disasters have occurred at other people's tables.